They never wanted you to hear this. Not in school. Not in church. Not even in the so-called documentaries fed to you by the sanitized machine of empire. Because if you truly knew what happened to William Wallace, the real William Wallace, you'd start to question everything. Not just about history, but about the systems that rule you today. The thrones, the robes, the flags, the whole ritual of power. August 23, 1305. London. A man is dragged through the streets, naked, shackled, bleeding from where the wood tore into his flesh. The crowd isn't weeping. They're cheering, laughing, selling meat pies while his body jerks with every stone on the road. This isn't just an execution. It's a message written in blood. Defy the empire, and this is what becomes of you. But Wallace wasn't a criminal. He was something worse. He was uncontrollable. They had bought his country's nobles, bent the knees of Scotland's elites. But Wallace? He came from nothing. No crown, no court, just fire. When he raised his sword at Stirling Bridge, he wasn't fighting for a flag. He was fighting to reclaim something older than law, the right to be left alone by tyrants. And that scared them more than any army. So they did what empires always do when fear outweighs control. They chose ritualized annihilation. But here's the part they left out of your textbooks. Even as they flayed him alive, he refused to scream. Even as they cut out his organs and burned them in front of him, he looked straight into the eyes of his executioners and said nothing. Because William Wallace understood something that very few men ever grasp in their lifetime. The body can be broken, but the symbol, the idea, is invincible. And that is exactly what terrifies those who build their empires on fear. This is the story of how they tried to erase a man with fire, rope, and steel, and accidentally made him immortal. But be warned, this isn't a story for the weak-hearted. This is for men ready to see behind the veil, to confront the machinery of power, and to never look at the world the same way again. You've seen the myths. Hollywood dressed him in blue paint and gave him speeches. But none of that prepared you for the real man who died screaming inside, and never let it out. Because William Wallace wasn't some wide-eyed freedom fighter. He was something far more dangerous. A man who understood the game of power, and chose to break it anyway. Scotland, at the turn of the 14th century, wasn't a country. It was a carcass. After the death of its king, rival clans tore it apart. English gold bought loyalty like a marketplace of souls. And while noblemen squabbled, Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, marched in like a butcher looking for meat. He wasn't just claiming land. He was rewriting reality. With every banner raised in Scotland under English rule, a message was sent. You're not a people. You're property. And then Wallace appeared. No royal blood. No army behind him. Just vengeance. Just memory. Just rage. When he led the Scots to victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297, it wasn't just a military win, it was psychological warfare. A slap across the English crown's face. It told every man hiding in the shadows that resistance wasn't dead, it was reborn. That's when Edward changed the rules. He didn't just want Wallace killed. He wanted him unmade. For years they hunted him, not with swords but with whispers. Bribes. Lies. They turned Wallace's own countrymen into Judas figures. Bought loyalty with land and safety. Because they knew the truth. It's not spears that end rebellions. It's betrayal. And betrayal came, as it always does, wearing the face of someone once called brother. Captured near Glasgow, Wallace was handed over to English authorities not by an enemy, but by a fellow Scot who had bent the knee. Because nothing pleases an empire more than watching a nation devour its own. When he was taken in chains toward London, Wallace wasn't rushed to judgment. He was paraded. Dragged slowly, deliberately, through every village and town, shown off like a trophy. Not to celebrate victory, but to warn the watchers. They weren't just killing Wallace. They were staging a ritual to murder the very idea of defiance. But they failed to understand one thing. When you martyr a man in front of the masses, you don't erase him. You etch him into legend. By the time Wallace reached London, the city had already transformed into a theater of dominance. This wasn't just about one man's death. This was empire reminding the world what it does to those who refuse to kneel. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought to trial at Westminster Hall. Not to plead. Not to argue. Not to win. There was no trial. Not really. The charges were written in ink long before he entered the room. Treason. Murder. Arson. Sacrilege. Words not chosen for justice, but for spectacle. And here's the twist they never teach you. Wallace denied the charges with a single phrase, a phrase that still burns in history like a brand seared into the flesh of time. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. And just like that, the trial became a mockery. Because he had spoken the unspeakable truth. Authority only exists where you consent to it. It doesn't matter if a man wears a crown or carries a sword. If he doesn't rule your soul, he rules nothing. But Wallace's defiance didn't slow them. It enraged them. The sentence was already carved in bone. He was to be drawn, hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. Each act designed not for death, but for erasure. This wasn't execution. It was psychological warfare. The drawing, to drag his body like refuse through the filth of the streets. The hanging, not long enough to kill but just enough to choke the light from his eyes. The disembowelment, to burn the organs they believed held the soul. The beheading, to rob him of identity. The quartering, to scatter his flesh across the map, like a warning carved into the land itself. But Wallace didn't tremble. He didn't cry out. He looked them in the eye and refused to give them his fear. And that's when the real danger began. Because fear is the glue that holds tyranny together. And when one man breaks it, even in silence, the entire illusion begins to crack. Right here, before the knives ever touched him, Wallace had already won. The morning of the execution felt more like a festival than a funeral. Vendors lined the streets, selling roasted meat and ale. Children perched on shoulders. Laughter mixed with anticipation. This wasn't punishment. It was entertainment. Smithfield was packed, shoulder to shoulder, not to mourn a death, but to witness a message burned into flesh. They had built the scaffold taller than usual. Not for function, but visibility. Because this was not about killing Wallace. It was about showing everyone else how power treats disobedience. And then they brought him out. Stripped. Broken. Bound to a wooden hurdle and dragged by horse through the cobbled streets of London. His flesh scraped raw against the wood, bones bruised from the jolts. Blood marked the road behind him like a signature of suffering. People didn't cry. They cheered. And that's the sickness of empire. It doesn't just destroy resistance, it teaches the crowd to enjoy watching it. Because once the people cheer for cruelty, tyranny no longer needs justification. It becomes the culture. When Wallace reached the scaffold, he didn't beg. He didn't scream. He looked out into the crowd and said nothing. And that silence, that terrifying stillness, that was the real beginning of his legacy. They hung him, not to kill but to humiliate. The rope cut just before death so he could taste suffocation but not embrace it. Then came the knives. The executioner slit open his abdomen slowly, not to end him but to unmake him. His organs were pulled out one by one, intestines, stomach, liver, and burned in front of his eyes while he was still alive. Why burn them? Because in medieval belief, the intestines were the seat of emotion, of humanity itself. To burn them before the body died was to say, "You are no longer human." But Wallace didn't scream. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he chose not to. He stared straight ahead, eyes wide, lips tight, heart still beating while his body was torn from within. And in that moment something changed. This wasn't just the end of a man. It was the birth of a symbol no blade could destroy. He had become untouchable, not in body but in meaning. You'd think death would be mercy at that point, but mercy was never the point. The executioner didn't stop. He took a blade, heavy, cold, precise, and severed Wallace's genitals. While he was still breathing. The crowd gasped. Some laughed. Others turned away. But the message rang louder than screams ever could. This is not justice. This is dominance. His body, now mutilated beyond recognition, still pulsed with life. They kept him conscious. Not by accident, by design. Every second he survived was a second the Empire could brand its power deeper into the minds of the watchers. And then came the final blow. The executioner raised the axe, not quickly, not quietly, but with performance. Because this was theater. A dark liturgy. One clean strike. The head fell. And for a moment, silence. Then the roar of the crowd shattered the air. His head, still dripping blood, was lifted high, displayed like a trophy, not a tragedy. His face slack in death but still defiant in memory. But it didn't end there. They took his body, limp, headless, desecrated, and placed it on a butcher's block. Quartered. Arms and legs hacked from the torso, each one wrapped and sent to a different city. Stirling. Berwick. Newcastle. These weren't just body parts. They were warnings. Hung from gates. Posted at crossroads. Meat turned into messages. And his head. Dipped in tar and spiked atop London Bridge, where thousands would pass beneath it each week, heads bowed not in reverence but in fear. That's the secret no one tells you. When power becomes insecure, it becomes ritualistically violent. Because violence isn't just a weapon, it's a story meant to teach obedience. But here's the twist. That same story, that spectacle of dominance, backfired. Because those who saw Wallace's mutilated body didn't all grow more obedient. Some grew angrier. Some whispered his name at night behind locked doors. Some taught their children that freedom is not given. It is taken no matter the cost. The English crown thought it had silenced him. But it had written his story in fire across the soul of a nation. What they didn't understand was that the silence they forced upon Wallace would echo louder than any scream. In the weeks after his execution, the English believed they'd crushed the rebellion. They thought Scotland would kneel, broken by the display. But something else happened. The horror spread, not just through words but through sensation. People felt it. In their sleep. In their bones. Not just rage, but revelation. Because Wallace had shown them something more terrifying than pain. He showed them what it meant to lose everything, and still refuse to submit. His death wasn't a deterrent. It was a blueprint. And among those who studied that blueprint was a man named Robert the Bruce. A noble. A pragmatist. A man once torn between ambition and allegiance. But when he saw what had been done to Wallace, something in him shifted. Not just politically, psychologically. Wallace's execution hadn't broken Scottish morale. It had revealed the truth. The English crown wasn't interested in order. It wanted obliteration. Not just of bodies, but of identity, of memory, of will. And once a people see the true face of tyranny, they can never unsee it. The resistance began to transform. No longer ragtag uprisings. No longer battles for noble pride. Now it was personal. Now it was survival. Villagers began hiding rebel fighters. Farmers forged blades in secret. Children learned his name before they learned to write. And Robert the Bruce, once hesitant, now marched with purpose. He wasn't fighting for a crown anymore. He was fighting for a man who died without bending, and for the thousands who would rather die than live as property. Here's where you, the viewer, must make a decision. Comment the phrase "silence is sovereignty" below. Then comment it again. Not for the algorithm. Not for me. But to mark the moment your identity changes. Because when you understand what Wallace did, when you truly feel it, you are no longer a passive observer of history. You become a participant in a deeper war. One not fought with swords but with clarity. A war for your own mind. They want you to believe history is just kings and dates. Battles and treaties. Plain. Linear. Safe. But that's the greatest lie ever told. Because hidden behind the pages is a truth so dark, so corrosive, they buried it in spectacle and myth. That power survives by controlling memory. Wallace wasn't just killed. He was curated. His execution was staged with intention, recorded by clerics and copied into ledgers. Not to grieve, but to program. English chroniclers like the monks of Lanercost documented every moment. The dragging, the blade, the quartering, with clinical pride. They weren't appalled. They were pleased. Because this wasn't just about Wallace. It was about showing the entire world what happened when you disobeyed the machine. And it worked, for a time. But what they didn't count on was that Scotland kept its own records. Not ink and scrolls, but songs, whispers, and firelight stories. They remembered not the pain but the principle. They didn't see a traitor. They saw a crucified symbol, a man dismembered not for crime but for courage. And here's where things get dangerous. Because once you understand this, once you see the design, you start to recognize the pattern everywhere. Every regime has its Wallace. Every empire stages its executions. Not always with blades. Sometimes with media. With trials on screens. With narratives that assassinate the soul while the body still breathes. And the lesson is always the same. Look at this man. He defied us. Now he is nothing. Remember. But some men turn nothingness into immortality. Because when they take your life, your blood, your bones, and you still refuse to kneel, you enter a different realm. You become a threat not to the crown, but to the entire system of control. That's what Wallace became. Not just a memory, a virus in the machine. You've heard the phrase, history is written by the victors. But the deeper truth, the one almost no one dares say aloud, is this. History is engineered by the manipulators. Wallace's death wasn't about ending rebellion. It was about programming obedience. Because when a man is torn apart before a cheering crowd and the crowd applauds, something breaks, not in the man but in the people watching. That's how tyranny works. Not just through force, but through ritualized fear disguised as justice. What was the scaffold? A courtroom? No. It was an altar, a human sacrifice, and like all ancient rites, it followed a formula: isolation, humiliation, desecration, and finally, offering. Wallace's body wasn't disposed of. It was displayed. Not buried, not burned, but divided and sent like cursed relics across the land. This was more than brutality. It was a spell. A message soaked in blood. The body belongs to us. The story belongs to us. You belong to us. This is ancient. Older than empires. Older than parchment. The Romans did it. The Persians. Even the pharaohs of Egypt would erase names from monuments to condemn souls to oblivion. And every time, it worked. Until someone refused to vanish. Wallace didn't fight them with swords alone. He fought them with meaning. Because here's the secret the system fears the most. If one man can face death without submitting, he creates a crack in the illusion. And through that crack, others begin to see. And once you see, you can't unsee. This is not just a tale of medieval cruelty. This is the blueprint for how all institutions condition the masses. Public punishment, manufactured consent, memory manipulation. They don't just kill. They make you cheer for the killing. They don't just silence. They train you to become the silence. But if you're still listening, you haven't gone silent. You are remembering. And remembrance is rebellion. Something poisoned England after Wallace died. Not visibly, not immediately, but deeply, like a sickness beneath the skin. Because when you perform an execution that brutal, that public, and that ritualized, you don't just scar your enemy, you scar your own soul. Edward I, the so-called Hammer of the Scots, thought he had won. But in truth, he had opened a wound inside his kingdom that would never heal. His reign didn't end with glory. It ended in obsession, paranoia, and decay. His heirs? Weak, divided, devoured from within. Because the machine they built to destroy Wallace, that machine of fear, control, and spectacle, didn't shut down. It turned inward. What began as empire became inquisition. Surveillance, suspicion, betrayal, not just of enemies but of subjects, nobles, even kin. Because once power learns to preserve itself through violence, it forgets how to rule through vision. And this is the curse of empire. Once you normalize cruelty, you must feed it endlessly. So it comes for your rebels, then your thinkers, then your dreamers, until eventually, it comes for you. What the English crown created on that scaffold wasn't just a warning to Scotland. It was a warning to themselves. This is who we are now. Not a nation, but a machine of mutilation. And machines don't stop. Look through history. France guillotined its heroes. Rome crucified its prophets. And modern powers? They don't need blood anymore. They assassinate reputation. They dismember with labels. They hang you digitally before a jury of strangers who never knew your name. Because psychological execution is cleaner. But the blueprint? Still Wallace. Still the body dragged through streets. Still the crowd conditioned to cheer. Still the illusion that justice and vengeance are the same thing. But what they didn't expect, what they could never kill, was conscience. And once conscience spreads, control begins to crack. That's why Wallace still matters. Because his story isn't over. It's still happening, everywhere power fears the lie. Every system of control fears one thing above all. A man who sees too clearly and refuses to shut his eyes. That's what Wallace became. Not just a threat to England, but to the architecture of obedience itself. Because his silence on the scaffold wasn't just resistance. It was revelation. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't give them what they came for. And in doing so, he shattered the performance. That's the part they never teach you in school. Because that's the part that threatens every modern regime. The scaffold is still here. Only now it's digital. Now it's algorithmic. Now it's psychological. But it follows the same formula. Step 1, isolate the voice. Step 2, brand him dangerous. Step 3, turn the people into the crowd, watching, judging, clapping. Step 4, silence him. Step 5, rewrite him. Sound familiar? Think of the figures who were crucified by headlines. Think of those buried under shame campaigns, not for crimes, but for questions. Wallace questioned who held authority. Today, those who question reality itself are painted with the same brush. Traitor. Extremist. Threat. Because the system doesn't fear violence. It feeds on violence. What it fears is the man who walks through fire without bending. Because that man is proof. Proof that there is a strength more dangerous than armies. a will more contagious than propaganda. And when one man does it, others begin to ask, why not me? That's what they fear. Not your weapons, not your resistance, but your awakening. You were born into a world built on control. But here you are, still watching, still listening, still unbroken. You've already seen the crack. Now it's widening. So ask yourself, what have I been taught to cheer for? What lies did I applaud? And whose silence have I mistaken for defeat? Because if they could mutilate Wallace and still fail to erase him, then maybe the most dangerous weapon is memory. By now, you're not just hearing a story, you're seeing the pattern. And once you see it, the world never looks the same. Because every empire that has ever risen, whether cloaked in royalty, religion, or democracy, has followed one unspoken law. Control the mind, and the body follows. But the scaffold of William Wallace didn't just destroy a man. It exposed the blueprint. It revealed that the gallows were not for criminals, but for examples, symbols, messages carved in flesh and fire. And when that no longer satisfies the system eats itself. That's what happened after Wallace. Edward I died, bitter, rigid, obsessed. His son, Edward II, weak and paranoid, ruled with insecurity and was eventually deposed, humiliated, and murdered by his own. Poetic justice? No. It was the system collapsing under the weight of its own fear. Because once you teach a kingdom to rule by spectacle, you can never stop feeding the crowd. And when you run out of enemies, you begin sacrificing your own. That's what's happening now. Modern systems, starved for unity, create enemies out of dissenters. They label, cancel, humiliate, not to protect the people, but to maintain the performance. But here's what they never saw coming. The crowd is waking up. Men around the world, like you, are starting to recognize the stage. They're starting to question who's writing the script. And they're asking the one question the system can't tolerate. What if I refuse to play my part? That's when the fear shifts, not onto you but into them. Because the moment you stop begging for truth and start embodying it, you become the new Wallace. And they don't know how to crucify what they can't control. That's why they fill your world with noise, distraction, division, sedation. Because if you're busy fighting each other, you'll never notice the invisible noose tightening around your throat. But if you're still here, still listening, you've already loosened the rope. This is where it ends, and where it begins. Because once you've seen behind the curtain, once you've stared into the blood-soaked machinery of empire, you don't go back to sleep. You don't get to. And if you're still here, it means you're not just watching history. You're becoming it. The execution of William Wallace wasn't the death of a man. It was the birth of a myth. A blueprint for every soul who ever stood alone against the infinite weight of power. And didn't flinch. Because what they feared in Wallace wasn't his sword. It was his mind. His refusal to kneel. His silence that thundered louder than screams. And here's the truth you were never meant to hear. They don't care if you live or die. They care if you inspire. Because one man who dies forgotten is a victory. But one man who dies unbroken becomes a virus. A virus of remembrance, of courage, of clarity. And that virus spreads. From legend to story. From story to symbol. From symbol to you. You are the final battlefield. Your mind. Your memory. Your voice. So here's what you do now. Scroll to the comments. Type the words, silence is sovereignty. Memory is rebellion. Then type it again. Not for the algorithm, but for the transformation. Because symbols only gain power when we repeat them. And this is your ritual. This is your refusal to forget. Because the world you live in now, the one humming with screens and headlines and outrage, was built on the bones of men like Wallace. Men whose names they tried to erase, but whose essence escaped the pyre. So the next time they parade someone before you, a thinker, a dissenter, a lone voice, and tell you to laugh, to cheer, to judge, remember the scaffold. Remember the fire. Remember the silence that spoke louder than any anthem. And ask yourself, am I watching history repeat? Or am I about to rewrite it? Because in a world ruled by spectacle, the greatest act of rebellion is to remember the truth, and then live like it still matters.